Here we go. We are recording. Hurrah!
Hello.
So welcome, Chris Arning. I'm
Hello.
Sarah de Nordwall, a bard with the Bard School, and this is Chris.
Hi. Hello, everybody.
And Chris is a very good friend of mine who is a poet, a fan of hip hop, writes hip hop, and you will discover during this podcast is a very interesting person. Now, today, we're going to be unlocking a conversation, as in all our Bard School podcasts, through poetry. Now, in our first one, we started with one of my poems, and then Dan Cote Davis just talked amazingly about all sorts of incredible things. And in the second one, I had Helen Munt, who commented on several of my poems. But today, Chris, who actually earns his living through semiotics, which he may be able to tell you about later, is going to be also doing a kind of poetry rally with me. So I'm going to launch with one poem, and then after we've talked about that, he's going to come back with one of his own. So thank you, Chris, for having
Looking forward to it. Looking forward to it.
The poetry rally possibility. So did you want to tell us a little bit about how you earn your living through semiotics? Because maybe just tell us what semiotics is. I know it's to do with meaning. That's about it.
Yeah, sure. Semiotics is the study of signs and communication, and it's a way of helping understand the world around us in more detail, and also understand the influences that implicit cues, communication, colour, typefaces have on us as people, essentially.
Wow. So pretty essential for navigating the landscape of today, really. Well done for working out how to extract cash from that. Brilliant.
Well, it is a way of, I mean, it's very relevant to branding, because branding is about conveying certain meanings and conveying positive associations. So it's really a part of that sort of world. But
sorry.
Go on.
One thing I wanted to ask about semiotics is it related to uncovering meaning or creating meaning? I mean, maybe that's too subtle a question. I don't know.
No, it's not. I mean, it's a very good question. I think semiotics is based upon the notion that there are certain constructed meanings in society, and you can kind of unravel those meanings. But obviously, as a semiotician, as someone doing this interpretive work, it's really important to be aware of your own biases, which is, as we know, a very, very hard thing. And we haven't talked about Buddhism, and obviously Buddhism is something I'm a big fan of and affiliate with. And it would say that the human being is, the capacity for self-delusion is massive. It's, I think a lot of my work is about trying to sort of become aware of various forms of delusion, essentially.
I find that slightly delightfully ironic on one level, given that I often associate, having read No Logo by Naomi Klein, branding with the idea of, spinning and conjuring possibly illusions and delusions to sell products that are possibly unconnected with the myth that accompanies them, which actually was the theme of my poem, Lipstick as a Spiritual Experience. But that doesn't mean to say that all brands are inauthentic, obviously.
No, I mean, it is an interesting question. So I feel like I'm on the back.
You may not want to talk about that, right?
Yeah, it's interesting. Let's just talk about the poetry, shall we?
I reckon we're going to come back to that point in the end. Seriously.
No, it's.
You have to.
I mean, the thing is, it's a massive question. I mean, I'm interested in branding because it's about communication fundamentally, and it's about culture and ideas. But where it aligns with the corporate world, obviously there are uses that are more or less productive, harmonious,
uses and abuses,
positive. But I'm someone that writes about, works for companies that are within my ethical policy, but also I do work where I seek to open people's eyes to the way visual culture works and washes over us, and the meanings that maybe are less helpful for people. So it's a big question. But I would say that branding can also be, like, for example, like the two of us as poets. Branding can also be that somebody actually, the reality is actually more wonderful than what is put out on the internet, that is visualized or manifest. So it's not always that branding is about seeking to hyperbolize or exaggerate something, and in fact, at its worst, in its worst excesses, gloss over the bad things that are happening and sort of
like greenwash and stuff.
Yeah, exactly. It can sometimes be that the product is better than the brand currently is, and branding can help you
Nice.
pop out the more positive things. So if I
Wonderful.
was to work with an independent and look at their, Instagram feed or their website, it would be about saying, look, you do these amazing things. This is part of who you are, and actually that's not coming across in the way you present yourself to the world.
Mm.
So that's also part of branding.
That's
So
very
yeah, I don't
interesting.
know. It's a really interesting
So
question.
it becomes a kind of act of disclosure of a richness of being rather than the opposite. Putting a coat onto an empty hanger. It's in fact revealing something that's worth looking at that might otherwise have not been noticed.
Yeah, I would say that is. I mean, I'd say in a sense, I don't know. I feel like we're kind of going into all sorts of areas. I was thinking we would leave for a bit later on, but I'm not a Freudian by any stretch of the imagination. But I mean, you could look at the metaphor for the semiotic analysis, kind of putting a brand on the couch and looking at sort of the sort of unsaid, hidden, subconscious, unconscious elements of what a product is, what a brand is, and try to tease those things out. And that can also be said, I mean, for good or for ill, the branding industry is pervasive. So if you're an individual who wants to be of service to a community, find a community like indeed you are with the Bard School and this podcast, you, by definition, you are one node in a network. You are one individual in a marketplace for attention, because we're living through the attention economy. Everyone's got finite attention. I mean, one of the scariest marketing sort of promotional pieces I've ever heard was Netflix, who say that their competitor is sleep. They're competing against sleep. They're not competing against Amazon Prime or heaven forbid the BBC or any sort of sort of commercial rival. They're thinking that because they have such a captive audience, their enemy is sleep. They want to eat to kind of make inroads into people's nighttime activities, essentially.
Wow.
So
invading our psyches at every level.
Yeah, but I would say I'm slightly gone off on a tangent, but I would say as an individual, as a poet, as a creative, you are working within a sort of system of meaning, and one thing you want to do is to be distinctive and meaningful within that system of meaning. And there's a lot of meaning that you have inside for your facticity, for your background, for your experiences, but a lot of that resides like a sediment within you. And friends will know. So I know what an amazing poet you are and how much work you've done and how incredible your work is on so many levels. And a lot of people obviously also know that, but not everybody knows. Not that you want everybody to know that, but there's a bigger audience of people who are aligned with your values who could also find out the wonderfulness of Sarah de Nordwall.
Well,
and branding is about amplifying those qualities, essentially, and also structuring them in a way that's easy to assimilate. So I feel, on the one hand, I don't need to be convinced of the evils of elements of corporate branding and indeed capitalism, that, as you know, that I don't need to be convinced of that. And it feels like a paradox that I'm working in this world when you learn a lot about me. But for me, my connection to it is ideas. I love ideas. I love language. I love, philosophy. I love communication. That's what I'm about. And it really saddens me that I've come on this podcast with such a terrible hair day.
Well, these are the priorities. Do you know what?
But it's been 3 months of lockdown, Sarah, and this bird nest bouffant is one of the results.
I think it's a fresh approach to your personal brand. We all have to have personal brands now. I think we should just work it.
Not so much a style as the repudiation of style, is what I like to say. When people say, "Oh, you've got an interesting hairstyle," no, it's not a style. This is the repudiation of style. So anyway, but I think the branding question you ask is really interesting, and I'm a bit torn by it. And we also have a lot of conversations about the future and the future of what it means to be human in this increasingly technological world. And I personally feel that branding as a concept is not going anywhere. And I believe it can have its positives. I really believe it can have its positives. And I try and do work that I believe in, or at least work that's not going to be totally detrimental.
I think one of the elements is that the fact that when we're setting up businesses on our own and stuff, and we have the choice seemingly to choose our values, means that we start walking quite a perilous path, because at first we can feel that we have to compromise our values in order to make money. And I think one of the challenges and the joys of it is that you can start to uncover the fact that your values actually could have monetary value as well, as long as you're walking a path of integrity. So I'm gonna segue into the first poem that I chose to kick off with today, because when you very kindly bought my book, this was the poem that you were most struck by, I believe. Well, I think it's the one you first sent me a text about. So I'm just going to read it and then have some of your thoughts on it, because in a way it's kind of the opposite of what we've been talking about, isn't it? It's called Ideology, and I'll read it and leave it there, and let's see what comes out of it. Okay,
go ahead.
Shall I read it and then share screen afterwards? Because I kind of like the idea.
Read it, get my reaction. Read it, get my reaction, and then we'll share the screen.
Cool.
I also want to say, just for the benefit of your listeners, that I had to force you to allow me to buy your book, because you were going to give me a copy. So the person we're dealing with here, guys, right? Sarah was gonna tell me not to buy a book because she wanted to give me a signed copy, and she did indeed, but I insisted on buying the book. Or actually,
well,
anyway.
Yeah, you need to work on my branding. You really do, Chris.
There we go. Anyway, go ahead, Sarah. I'm all ears. Ideology.
Dropping an illusion is like losing an impossibility. There's so much potential in it, but at first there's nothing. Previously, you realize you've been using a robotic arm instead of your own. Powerful but clumsy, unnuanced in almost every way that mattered. But now you've let it drop. You panic. That other arm, the one you must have had before, didn't I chop it off? But the metal looked so promising and so worth the sacrifice of flesh and blood. But you forget. You reach back in your memory for a time of natural movement, a spontaneous touch, but you can't recall. Perhaps the arm is somewhere else, perhaps still with you, under a coat, unused. Perhaps it will regrow. You just don't know. And so you stop, unarmed, and wait for freedom.
Well, it's a very powerful poem. It's a poem with a lot in it.
I'm going to share it there, Chris, so you can see it.
Okay. Well, I think the idea of dropping an illusion, first of all, is fascinating. Yes, is maybe most of our adult lives dedicated one way or another to dropping an illusion? That's often the way I feel. Illusions about ourselves, about our childhoods, about what we thought about life. But yeah, I think the first two lines are very, very powerful. They could almost live as a sort of an epigram, a part of an epigram, something that's a sort of a lapidary phrase that sort of nudges people to think a bit more. And then you've got there's so much potential in it. In what? But and this is the thing about poetry is it ties you up in these kind of logical impossibilities sometimes, but they're very very captivating. But I think later on, and that's what I like about poetry in general, and this poem, is that later on you come to understand what it is that these early lines refer to. Because I feel that they set up a sort of a sort of destiny for the poem, and then the poem sort of works that out in some other way. You seem to have flipped very, very fast through the poem.
Sorry, my love. I was just going to go back to the robotic arm.
Yeah, the robotic arm. Yes, the robotic arm. I think we've talked about this before, but I feel it's a sort of metaphor for a lot of things, isn't it? In my mind, it's a metaphor for groupthink, something that's unnuanced, as you say, and mechanistic, essentially. And
Do
I
you
think
feel
there's
that?
something.
Sorry, carry on.
I was going to say, I think there's something really important about the fact that it's an arm as well,
Oh yeah.
because as we know, the arm is, so much of what makes us human is through our ability to manipulate things. I don't mean that in a sort of Machiavellian sense. I mean literally make tools, create technologies, but also the way in which language is said, and our psychological development is said to derive from our ability to sort of handle objects and pick up an object and realize it's different from ourselves. That sense of the use of our hands in cognitive development as well. So having a robotic arm, what does that do to our development?
Well, it means that you're losing touch with your human nature and taking on the logic of power, basically, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the aspects of an ideology, is that you exchange the organic, the natural, and the human for power as a principle.
Yeah.
You exchange the sacred chaos for an unholy order, shall we say?
Sure. Well, that's a really good way of putting it. Yeah. I mean, I think that the thing for me about it is when we talk about this coming technological revolution, well, it's ongoing technological revolution, but the idea of us being at the knee of the curve where there will be a massive dramatic acceleration in our intermediation and as human beings, how we live with data and information. There is something quite scary about, for example, they talk about the serendipity of memory, the serendipity of meeting people, and how algorithmic dating, for example, or which is something I'm not engaged in at the moment, dating or various networks, how they work through algorithm, and how there's a sort of rigid ironclad logic to that, which removes serendipity, but also the notion of echo chambers and filter bubbles, and how ideologically people become aligned and ensconced in certain nested communities where they're never going to encounter people who believe something different from themselves. And we have differences in terms of our beliefs, but we also have a lot of respect and love for each other, I think, and also a huge shared mission in terms of poetry and spirituality. So, and I think that's a really positive thing. But sorry, we'll come on to that a bit later. But I think back to the ideology, I feel there's what's terrifying about this, the potential for the ways in which technology and humanity will develop, is we could find ourselves in a place where, as you've said, we don't remember what it was like to be fully, living as a human being, as an individual, without the intermediation of this technology and the ability, for example, of metadata to do. And as human beings, we've always benefited our forgetfulness, our ability to forget. And it reminds me of that Jorge Luis Borges short story about a man called Funes the Memorious, which was about a man who had some kind of a mental perturbation or incident, and then thereafter he was unable to forget anything. So everything he saw, he retained in perfect detail. And as you can imagine, this became a sort of King Midas-like curse that looked like a gift on its endowment. And he, for example, would walk past a tree, and every sort of vein of every leaf would be committed to memory. And this inability to forget became a total horror for him, a total nightmare for him, in the British sense of nightmare, in a literal nightmare, not being able to, that's not like a Southwest Trains nightmare, I mean, a sort of existential, cataclysmic emotional collapse. So I guess for me, this poem, just back to the poem, I feel this poem has all of that in there. It has this sense of wistfulness for a time of humanity where all these embedded human qualities were available to us: the ability to forget, the ability to connect with people and not have this intermediating technological filtering mechanism, the spontaneity as well, in a world
what's
where
interesting
so much
about the fact that you talk about picking up on the technological point, and maybe we can talk a bit later about your novel that you're writing, or not, I don't know, because it's such an interesting novel. The fact that that technology is just one way of expressing or manifesting, shall we say, what a wrong idea can do. Because, I mean, technology can have its uses, but one can experience being inside an ideology and having a kind of robotic sense of non-communication with people, you know, even without the, you know, the added interference of a technological interface. So, for instance, I think when I was writing that poem, it was an act of personal realization about a set of ideas I had been inhabiting, which were keeping me back from getting in touch with myself. And that the experience of leaving a set of comfortable ideas behind is extremely frightening. It's like,
yeah, absolutely.
And that's why when we're having conversations with people who are different in their scope of ideas, we've got to remember that we're asking them to do something very painful and scary, to stand unarmed if they're going to listen to what we're saying.
Yeah.
And we have to be willing to do the same.
I think that's a very, very poignant observation, and well, not an observation because you wrote the poem, so it's not really an observation.
But that's the funny thing about writing poems, the poems seem to come from another zone.
It's an observation for me, not for you. Yeah, no, and I agree. I think you're right, and it's something that in personal development, not wanting to go into any too much detail, but when we're asked to leave behind, when we're asked to undergo spiritual transformation, certainly in the Buddhist tradition, there's a spiritual death that has to precede spiritual rebirth. And I don't know if you saw the Edith Sitwell.
I saw the first 10 minutes. Yeah.
An unlikely, I wouldn't say heroine, but an unlikely reference point I find quite inspiring in quite a few ways. And she talked about the life of the artist being painful because it involves a daily spiritual resurrection. I mean, I'm slightly garbling her words. I can sort of feel her spectre tapping me on the shoulder and telling me I'm
looking formidable.
Well, looking extremely forward. Not the sort of ghost you want to be haunted by.
She'd approve of your hair, though.
Well, I think she would. But I mean, I feel that that's a sort of grander in a way, but I think it's a parallel to what you say about people, because I feel comfort and delusion are the handmaidens of any ideology. So we become very comfortable in this world with people that share our views. And I don't think delusion needs to mean, you know, like the kind of the old sort of adage, denial isn't just a river in Africa. You know, I know there's a way in which delusion can become a sort of dismissive, pejorative term to sort of condemn someone as like a Walter Mitty character, like a fabulous. I don't think you need to be a fabulous to suffer from delusion. I personally feel, and this is a Buddhist conception, that it is built into the human condition. And whether you want to go down the T.S. Eliot route and talk about the human being able to only take so much truth or reality, or whether you just feel that it's the fact that our perceptual apparatus isn't able to encompass truth. And there's a great quote when I went to India for a conference a couple of years ago, the Semiotician conference, which is part of my work in helping propagate the word of semiotics. I went to Mumbai, and Devdutt Pattanak, who is a scholar on Hindu mythology, talks about the notion of the godlike perspective. And there's a great quote where he said something like, I'm going to garble the gods now, but he says something like, Shiva has 1,000 eyes, Vishnu has 1,000,000 eyes, me and you only have two, sorry. So how can we expect to encompass the truth and reality in any sort of comprehensive way? And it was a far more impressive quote. I'm sorry, I'm slightly garbling it, but the point being that, you know, we only see so much. And I feel like once we become ensconced in these safe areas, we, to your point, we do sort of cling to them. And you know, I think
where we share something there definitely is that we stand always on the threshold of mystery. And as a Catholic, the first thing that one accepts is that really, you know, we are created capable of receiving God, but we aren't God. And that's the difference. So there's I heard the other day someone said that there are 3 basic worldviews. One is that there is only the universe and matter. The second is that there is only God, and that everything exists within God, and that we're all not really separate. And then the third is that there is God and the world. So as a Catholic, I'll be saying, wow, I am a material creature, but transcendence exists, and that I stand as a person, a human person on the shore, on the shoreline. So although one might have a set of beliefs that encompass wanting to speak about the omniscient God, we aren't omniscient. And I think ideology comes in when you start to take on board the idea of personal omniscience.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean that you have radical non-knowledge, but this idea of mystery is extremely important antidote to ideology. There's always something we don't know, and that although God can be within us, is also beyond. So
yeah, I mean, I that makes a lot of sense. And I think the word humility kind of occurs to me as a sort of accompanying thought to what you've just said, that the idea of there being mystery outside the horizon of our experience, but doesn't mean it doesn't exist or have tangible value, is obviously a very solid, a very salutary belief to have. I think it's likely to make you a better human being, if I can't say that as a too grand a statement.
Yeah, because and I think the whole process of writing is really mysterious and interesting. We talked about signs and symbols and interpretation, but when one enters into the artistic process, and the Bard School in its original conception was about trying to bring together artists who were wanting to live a life of faith and asking, well, what does it mean to be an artist? What is my interior life? How is my interior life affected by the Holy Spirit? And what is that about? So if I take the Catholic Catechism off the shelf, which is over there, nice and bright yellow, and I open it up on the section about telling the truth, which comes under the 8th commandment, there's a section about art, and it says that art is the revelation. Again, I'm going to garble the gods, as it were, the revelation of the inner riches of the human person. And so, and it says many other beautiful things. And that is such an important antidote to oversimplifying other people, which is why I find it so important to have a conversation based on poetry between people who might have different views about all kinds of things, because then you discover these inner riches. And when you care for the inner riches under the poet's eye of another person, you really can't dismiss their experience anymore, even though you might disagree with their opinions. And I think you and I would agree on the fact that there is a lamentable thing happening in society at the moment, in which to disagree with someone is interpreted as hating them. And that is a very alarming anti-development. And I think it might be revealing the presence of a huge amount of trauma in people and in life, that they are so triggered by not being agreed with that they feel they're instantly being annihilated.
Yeah. Well, I think it is something that people feel uncomfortable, I think, having their views shaken, their worldview shaken, and I think your poem does a great job of bringing
Chris,
that out.
If you could read us your poem about writing itself, because it returns to the natural as well, doesn't it? It's called some sort of scansion.
Absolutely.
And although I could definitely talk with you endlessly about ideology and also the theme of spiritual abuse that arises from that, because even spiritualities can contain their own cultish elements, whereby you get closed down rather than opened up by your spirituality. But maybe that's a conversation we can continue in the comments. But I think some sort of scansion responds to that.
I'm gonna have to put my cap on, I think, because my hair is looking so bad.
You see, we've got some branding revealed now there. I can't remember what it is.
Adidas branding. Okay, so this is.
Can you share screen as well? Yeah, I think I.
Oh yeah, well, I'll do the. I can share screen, but I'll read it first.
After you've read it, I love this poem.
We can do it. Yeah. Okay. So it's called Some Sort of Scansion.
Great.
So scan yourself. Upon awakening, scan yourself. Relax into your unstressed syllables and celebrate them for the space they give to those around them to live in their rhythm. Plumb your resonances for your truest cadence, and those fugues that refuse to be cast away, in their gentle nooks abide, then fathom, further down, burrow where a poem kernel hides that they call the heart. Marvel at its artless fertilities, drink deeply its fondest parts. Scan your body's fleshy syntax, gently noting its soft diacritics. Relish its lumpen unevenness, be gleeful never to measure up. Scan yourself from head to metrical feet, for the iams, the trochees, for the dactyls, the spondies, these impurities that made you, those pullulating and teeming metabolisms of fate. And what becomes you today? Some days you'll be elegy, some days you'll be Sestina, some days you'll be Villanelle, some days you'll be Terza Rima, and some days just blank verse. So scan yourself, possess yourself, recite yourself, pour over yourself, do a volta, resolve yourself into sestets, then step out of soliloquy, be apostrophe to the world, arise, your stanzas complete, and just let the words come.
That is just so fantastic. There's so many things I want to say about that. But first of all, I'm just going to kind of tell the phrases that pop, you know.
Shoot and then I'll, yeah.
So the, you know, the artless fertilities. I love that. The artless fertilities, the effortlessness, the spontaneity that arises when one just allows oneself to do whatever you're doing, scanning yourself. This is some kind of meditative process, but it's also about poetry too. Gorgeous, artless fertilities. I often find when I'm running workshops and I just say, just write. And they go like, tell us about form. And I'm like, no, write. You know, and it's like, and then they write these incredible things. Then be gleeful, never to measure up. It's so fantastic. You know, like permission to fail, fail fast, forget the word fail. You know, it's like, it's fantastic. Be gleeful. What a great word. And then possess yourself. So interesting. Yeah. If you can stand up inside of yourself and let yourself speak, and let other people speak and give them the space to speak, there's a new world right there. And this particularly striking phrase, I think, step out of soliloquy, because, you know, people think that, you know, when you're writing poetry and want to perform, it's all about you. But in reality, you, by speaking, you step out of soliloquy and invite dialogue. And that is the path of spirituality, because this solipsistic world in which it's only me, my panic, and my identity, do not speak against my chosen identity, or I will have to kill you or close you down. It's completely, you know, finds its antidote in something like this, where you can possess yourself, therefore you don't need to possess somebody else.
Yeah, and that's brilliant. Thank you so much. And I really always appreciate your, you know, your open-heartedness and generosity of spirit where it comes to poetry, and hopefully we share that. I think we're both very encouraging poets of other poets, and
yeah,
I think that's a great thing, and there's not enough of that out there, I would say. But the possession point, I mean, I did a course, an online course with an American school of poetry.
Oh, wow.
Back in 2009, and one of the modules was, well, we were looking at various different poetic forms, and one of them was the apostrophe, which I hadn't been aware of was a sort of second person address to some other entity. The word apostrophe is a sort of double meaning. So of course, grammatically, the apostrophe is something that pedants like myself despair when we see the grocer's apostrophe being used where it's not required and there is no possessive.
I have to say that looking at you, Chris, I would never say, if I'd seen you for the first time today, that was one of your pet peeves. But there we go. That's the delight of people not being what you expect.
It is. Well, it's obviously the hip hop vibe I'm giving off, but actually, as you will discover, hip hop is people involved in hip hop are really into their words. But no, I would say, yeah, the apostrophe to the world thing is very much about being, you know, possessed by the world in a way, and this idea of possession.
Possessed by the world.
Yeah, exactly.
What does that mean in that instance exactly?
Well, I feel it's, you know, we are part of the world, and actually the world feeds our poetry, you know, and is fed by the poetry, and we're fed by the world. So I feel like there was a juxtaposition between the step out of soliloquy and the B apostrophe, and a kind of contrast set up there as well.
So to clarify for my poor brain, an apostrophe is a dialogue with the world or speaking to the world. It's something I've not heard of before.
It's speaking to the world, yeah. In terms of the poetic form, yeah, is my understanding as a second form.
That's very interesting, because, you know, when I set up workshops and stuff and I make up little exercises for people, I often tell them, I said, forget everything you knew about poetry, but just use the word you, as in the second person singular, and write to you, whoever it is, doesn't matter. But it seems to produce the most interesting results. And I suppose perhaps it's a bit like, you know, Buber's work about I and thou. You know, he's a remarkable Jewish mystic, and his, you know, his catchphrase is I and thou, and that his desire is that we have this more personal approach to the world and obviously to God, because the Jewish insight was that God wants to speak to us and we can speak to God. And that was at the core of it, really. And it takes away from this mechanical view of the world. And when you scan yourself in your poem, you're getting in touch with your body, getting in touch with reality. And I remember that a friend, Sarah Larkin, as she now is, and I'm going to be having her on a podcast too, she talked to me about her spiritual journey, and she said that she felt that in most of her childhood and teenage years, she was in soliloquy. And then when she became a Christian and entered onto a spiritual path, she entered into dialogue with the world. So she went from monologue to dialogue. And that was her experience of spiritual awakening. And I thought that was quite an interesting observation.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Do you want me to bring up the poem?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. Got it here.
You've got lots of wonderful grammatical content about poetry itself, actually. But what I love about it is that it's spontaneity that's at the heart of it, rather than the cleverness. I'm a bit scared of the academic poetry world, and yeah, I'm a bit scared of it. I don't really relate to it. I just get on with my own thing.
Well, I mean, that's obviously one of the big themes in this poem, I would say, is, I mean, I would say big theme. I'd say it's a subsidiary theme, because really it's about poetry's inextricable link with spirituality and discovering who we are as people. And the hardest task I think any artist has is working out who they are and what their voice is. And for me, meditation is one way I sort of go inside and work out what it is I want to say and what's most important.
And do you do that consciously, Chris, or do you think it just appears? How about I don't
meditate to find ideas. I meditate to calm the asuras inside, as the Buddhists would say. The asuras being the sort of Titan-like, power hungry, power obsessed and addicted gods. And you know, the wheel of suffering has a series of different archetypes that are considered to live within every human being, and the asura is the sort of the angry, wrathful side. And I meditate in order to do that, and that's to calm my own sort of angers, frustrations, defects of character, whatever you want to call them. But in doing so, one of the byproducts of that is sometimes incredible insights incredible for me. I mean, I'm not saying this in an arrogant way, but I mean, there are things that surprise me that come out of me. Exactly, I access a new voice. Exactly. So,
you know, well, when you talk about encountering the Titans, asuras, did you call them? Yeah,
I did. Yes.
Right. Yeah. Is it a process of sensing the presence of something, like sensing the presence of an emotion or a desire, and then by remaining in meditation, remaining still, you refuse to engage with it, and then it just kind of passes on? Would that be a good description of that?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Yeah. So I'm trying to understand how you know, when people meditate and then these things come up, because there's no doubt that when one is still, things come up that otherwise one can push down by eating one's birthday chocolate, for example. So, you know, things come up, and then how do you deal with them? Do you just let them pass? Do you acknowledge their presence and let them pass? Is that what it's about?
It's very difficult to describe in a way. I mean, I would say it's a sort of, it is a bit of a kind of almost like a positive haunting, I would say.
A positive haunting.
Yeah. So you become possessed. I mean, the possessed yourself is, in a way, you become suffused with a consciousness that is kind of is your own, but is sort of separate from your own in a sense. And I don't sort of stop the meditation when words have percolated into my consciousness that I think would be interesting to explore. I push through and continue to meditate, but it is it does sort of remain with me, but I will continue to sort of breathe and be introspective and count my breaths and stay in a more concentrated state. Although more recently, where I have meditated, particularly with other people, it seems that more often than not, a poem will come to me. And so the expectation that a poem will come to me almost can sometimes disturb the depth of my absorption, if that makes sense, because I don't want to forget the words. So in that situation, I'm sort of torn between my desire to deepen my meditation on a spiritual path and my desire to be a creative and to capture the words that can, if I'm trying to keep them in my memory, disturb my meditation anyway, because sort of focusing on semantics isn't really part of the point of meditation. And
see, that's very interesting point.
Escaping that world is the point.
One of the poems that I wanted to do later is a poem that that I wrote when I went back to church recently, and there's something to do with sitting in the stillness and allowing a space for one's freedom. I think, as far as I'm aware, a time of prayer is slightly different to meditation, but there are some parallels there, because prayer is a conscious desire, I think, to worship God who is outside of us, but at the same time God is inside of us. So there's something slightly different going on, but there are some parallels. And there's no doubt that freedom is increased when you are aware of what you want to do, and these other voices and other presences, whatever they are ontologically, you're allowing them to go, or you're saying, no, I don't need you right now. And I think that's very fascinating and very liberating, because there's no doubt that when I started to write, I discovered that there were all these other characters and voices, and anybody who's written a novel knows that these things sort of seem to have a life of their own at some level. And I think Tolkien thought of a word for it. He called it subcreation as well, that we can create within creation. And that's one of the gifts we have. But what this process is of coming to terms with these other elements that are within our personal interior space, and to some extent part of us and yet not, is a very fascinating question. And how the process of different kinds of prayer release us from the elements that we don't want to have make up our personality.
Sure. No, I'm sure there's a parallel there in terms of prayer and meditation. Wow. But yeah, this is my experience, and it's funny because, as you say, that almost there's two things happening. There's, on the one hand, there's an absorption into yourself. On the other hand, it seems to be that there's a mining that happens of something, an idea that comes out from within this process that isn't the point of this process, but seems to be a byproduct of this process.
Yes. And maybe it's a gift of the process.
Which is a strange thing to say.
Maybe it's a gift that's necessary. I mean, when I wrote the poem that I'll do at the end of our podcast, or towards the end of our podcast, it was after this time of prayer, and I was, sometimes, in prayer you just have silence, and you keep the heart silent as much as one can. So it sounds incredibly similar to meditation, but you're keeping your heart as silent as it can be in the presence of God. And what arises, you leave aside, and you just sit under the gaze of the one who loves. But in that process, exactly as you've described, sometimes these words appear. And sometimes I think, am I doing the wrong thing in just writing this all down? Because maybe I'm just not concentrating on my prayer time as I should be. But in fact, because I've found it such a healing process, and sometimes tears come and revelation comes, I think, well, maybe that's God's gift to me in this time.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Chris, just looking at the time, I'm going to have to do our next poem, you know, because it springs out of, perhaps we can post some of these somewhere that people can find them, or I don't know whether you're going to save them up for a book or
let me
an album. But let's just see right to the bottom of your poem there.
Stop share. Oh, sorry. Do you want me to reshare quickly?
Yeah, just so people can see the bottom of it. That ending was fantastic. Yeah, there you go. That's it. Yeah. Arise, your stanzas complete, and just let the words come. It's very liberating. And, you know, often I find when I've written something, and I wonder if you do too, the ending is a surprise, and it's like a resurrection moment.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I felt that the ending for this was very much, actually, in a way, it was sort of parallel to the process I've talked about, which is that the poem is a byproduct of a meditative process. And in a way, this final stanza is a byproduct of the introspection that I've covered in the preceding words. So there's been a kind of a squeezing out or a birthing of something. And this is the punctuation point. This is the sort of apotheosis of that entire resurrectory, transformatory process.
Lovely. I'm going to have to look up apotheosis.
So on to your next poem.
Yes, here we go. Now this actually, you asked me to have a conversation once when I first met you, and one of my insecurities, of which, you know, there's a very long list really, but one of my insecurities, which I shared with you early on, was that I didn't really feel I had the right to be a poet, certainly not a performance poet or a spoken word poet, because I felt that terrain was kind of really fully inhabited by people who were black, cool and young, and I was really fell into none of those categories. But so when you actually asked me to do this podcast and go to this quite funky place where you're working, I was completely overawed and a bit terrified. But anyway, I was quite pleased that you'd invited me into some kind of dialogue, and this was a poem that I think I did in that because when I'm invited to do something, I just pray and I choose intuitively what to take along, and I chose this. And at the time, I didn't know that you were really interested in calligraphy. So let's do the poem and see what follows. And by the way, I don't know if I mentioned then, but this poem, somebody said they'd seen on the notice board of a Carmelite monastery. So I felt that was really an arrival moment for me. If my poem gets sent to a Carmelite monastery and pinned up on their notice board, then for me, I've arrived. So, you know, book of prizes aside, I felt I'd arrived that day. Okay, so warrior. In Asia, warriors do calligraphy. They know that beauty is an act of war, a great assault against the darkness of impenetrability, against the chaos and the tearing of the word. And here in Europe also, where the spiritual warriors held the quill, and with each stroke marked out the place where light could dwell, we feel the focus of the human heart with laser reverence, marking out the path.
Well, yes. Well, I mean, your listeners may or may not know, or viewers may or may not, that I do calligraphy. So Japanese calligraphy, as it is. And I'm a big believer in calligraphy as a sort of martial art, but it's not a art for dealing with others. It's a martial art for sort of dealing with yourself, in a sense. So
I was really surprised when you told me that, when I read this to you, because I just chose it by instinct, really. And you didn't look like a person who did Japanese calligraphy at first sight. So I am interested by the process of what is unlocked when people share poetry. It's
well, you never know. You never know what you're gonna You
Or are
never
you
know.
going to knock again?
You should never judge a book by its cover, Sarah.
Absolutely.
But yeah, I mean, it's yeah, I mean, it's bizarre to me because looking back at this, I sort of wasn't sure. I was trying to work out in my mind whether we'd had a conversation about calligraphy before you shared this poetry. And you said that you shared it before you knew that I did calligraphy.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Oh, you read, so I think you'd written it before
Yeah,
we talked about it. And then when I mentioned it, you shared it with me, I think.
yeah.
My recollection. Doesn't matter anyway. But yes. I mean, it feels like, I mean, it relates a little bit to, I know there's another poem which you may do around Japanese influence on
Yeah.
you. But here you're talking about a European tradition of calligraphy, in a sense, being parallel to the sort of East Asian tradition. Do you want to sort of say a bit more about that?
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, I'm not even sure where the poem came from originally. It just sort of appeared in my mind, and I'd probably been just watching Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, and I just liked the way the girl did her calligraphy and her swordsmanship, and I thought that's very exciting. And I was thinking about beauty being the best kind of antidote to the chaos and to tearing the word. And I just looked at the contrast of the different types of disciplines. So you've got this free-form spontaneity warrior-like thing going on with the Japanese martial art. And yet I thought, well, there's a similar kind of laser reverence for truth that we do in the European tradition, where it can look very still and disciplined, monks keeping alive the gospel for centuries in Irish monasteries and in the north of England, whilst, barbarian hordes are raging across Europe, just smashing things to pieces. And they're just painstakingly writing out the word of God, the path where light can dwell. And I was just fascinated by that relationship between discipline and spontaneity and light. And I guess that's what came out. With each stroke marked out the place where light could dwell. So again, that's the power of the word to contain something intangible, which returns us to the beginning of our conversation about semiotics, which is why I remember, I was very suspicious of the way we studied language when I was at university, because it was very influenced by a very anti-metaphysical view of language, in which language was seen and words were seen in some cases as just a way to keep people apart or a way to create secrets, and that they were signs that you could invent, but they didn't resonate with any reality, because reality at a spiritual depth was not perceived to exist. Because I think my university was very influenced by Marxist thinking, which was all about, which I've mentioned in another podcast, Do Not Inquire About Origins. And I placed myself quite at the opposite end of that in a way. This language is a disclosure of wealth, a disclosure of beauty, a disclosure of spirituality. It doesn't invent it. It may co-create with it, because our nature is made in the image of God, and therefore we can evoke, recognize, and create things of beauty that are unique to me, unique to you, although within certain traditions. And I'm excited by the fact that when the human heart focuses, something of light comes in that is beyond ourselves. And that's what I find exciting about the artistic process, is that we become not a conduit in the sense of, in the Greek sense or the New Age sense of channeling something that has no relationship to us, like channeling spirits or something ghastly like that, but actually being in a relationship to a spirit who knows us, loves us, and creates us, and therefore shines forth from us in a way to make us shine more of who we are, which is one of the reasons I love your poem that you just did, because you can possess yourself in a good way when you let the light shine through. So yeah, I guess those are all of the things that made me think about, and that if I was to enter into warfare against ideology, the way to do it would be through beauty, not through argument.
Well, I mean, I think beauty is a good starting point always. I mean, I think what you say about focusing the human heart. I mean, my calligraphy teacher, Japanese calligraphy teacher, has been during lockdown has been writing out the Heart Sutra every morning in excruciatingly tiny script.
I've seen it,
And
actually.
it,
I've seen it.
yeah, I
And
think I
it looks
showed you the
very,
image.
yeah, beautiful.
And it's meant to be one of the things you can do for spiritual improvement. And certainly she talks a lot about how sort of beneficial for the heart and heart intelligence indeed doing calligraphy is. And very much when I do calligraphy, often what results is not beautiful on the page or the
Right,
washi, as we call it in Japanese, on the paper,
right.
but I believe it is a spiritually improving practice. So I believe I'm improving, I'm
Mm.
becoming more, because when you do calligraphy, it's a constant battle against your own disappointment with your limitations.
You write a lot about
And
that, yeah.
yeah, it is. It's a sort of spiritual practice in that sense, because it's, and you talk about, they know that beauty is an act of war. And then that's a brilliant phrase. And I think it's, in a sense, finding our own beauty is, that the introspective process that is required to
Mm.
find the beautiful things, the most personal things often, um, is a violent process. And I think it was Wallace Stevens who talked about poetry as an internal violence,
Wow.
or the working out of internal violence. There's a quote, again, I've garbled everyone I've quoted, I think, today on this podcast, but
We've got the
words to that effect. And for me, I've written 2 or 3 poems about the martial, the Spartan ascetic qualities of doing Japanese calligraphy, but I feel there's also a very a softening of the heart that comes through doing this practice. And I know that in the Christian tradition, soft-heartedness is and writing on the tablets of the heart seems to be,
mm.
a conceptual concept that I'm sure you can identify with in some
Well,
way.
when I remember when I did read you that poem, you then did a piece, or you'd already done a piece of calligraphy that was the word bravery, which I thought was beautiful, because I hadn't associated my writing with bravery, but it really resonated. And so when I put that poem up in an exhibition, I put your calligraphy next to it, and people were fascinated by seeing the two things together. It was lovely. And
Sort of
it
cringe.
takes courage, doesn't it, to get in contact with yourself,
Dear.
which returns to the whole theme of ideology. It does take courage to enter into the perilous realm, as Tolkien refers to, his Tales from the Perilous Realm, which is talking about fairy, Faery, the realm where we discover, the archetypal truths, if you like. It's a perilous path, and there are traps for the unwary, he says. And I think that's where there's a
Indeed.
similarity in all spiritual paths. You have to be, it's not a joke, it's not a hobby, it's not a pastime, as it were. And I remember when I first started learning Hebrew, and I just loved writing out the letters. It soothed my heart so much. And as you know, my father was from a Jewish family on both sides, but he was never an observant Jew. But there was something about myself rediscovering Hebrew. I say rediscovering, I should say discovering, but it felt like rediscovering. And when I wrote out these letters, I would sit on the train and write out these letters, these, Bereshit, bara, Adonai, blah, blah, blah. And I was just, it gave me such joy. And if I'm feeling a bit low or depressed, I just write these letters, and I love them. And once I was sitting on a train writing out these Hebrew letters, and there was a couple sitting opposite me, and they were having a discussion, as it turns out later, quite a heated one. And they looked at my Hebrew letters, and the girl said, "Look at her writing that Hebrew." And she said to me, in the end, she just couldn't help asking. She said, "What are you doing writing out that Hebrew? Are you Jewish?" And I said, "No." And she looked at her, as it turned out, then fiance, and said, "That's it. We're having a proper Jewish wedding." And it seemed like the end of the conversation is like, this is it. We're going to do it. We're going to have a proper wedding, and we're going to have Hebrew prayers and everything.
Wow. That's
I
great to inspire.
doing my little Hebrew in contact with obviously deeply on her heart. And I don't know, it was a nice moment.
Beautiful, beautiful. Yeah, I mean, that poem just really speaks to me in terms of the, yeah, again, you capture so effortlessly, apparently, some really big concepts. I'm just thinking whether I should do my poem Push Through, because it really seems to sort of
Oh yes, do. That's a recent one,
with
isn't it?
me.
Yes,
And
please.
yeah, and let me do that one, and you can have a little bit of reaction to that.
Yeah.
So push through. Just push through and redeclare your allegiance to determination, to those days of grit, of a progress measured out in inches. So push through those vilifications of your art that ring out whenever you are being most true. Push through those straits of self-sabotage, against resistance and the ballast of your past, echoing in the contempt of those voices, a desperate resistance whose cries you barely hear when it's in your slipstream. So push through the purgatory of self-doubt, through limbos of prevarication, cloying magmas of unworthiness. Run the gauntlets of self-hate and stave off shame's embrace. Push through and reclaim those fondnesses that you feared would never be part of your legacy. Push through to imagination's homecoming, to today's elysiums of gladness, through to fertile fields of you, frolic in the beatitudes of a life where God kisses every moment.
That is so beautiful. Chris, can you read the last paragraph again, or the last sort of 5 lines? Because there was a slight distortion in the line, and I just love, I'd really want to hear that again. Sure. Imagine it from Imagination's Homecoming, which is such a great line.
Yeah. So push through to imagination's homecoming, to today's elysiums of gladness, through to fertile fields of you, frolic in the beatitudes of a life where God kisses every moment.
That's just fantastic, isn't it? It's just great, running the gauntlet of self-hatred. Now that's a very good line, isn't it? And I think most people who create experience that sense of having to overcome the shame of not thinking you're going to be, in my case, black enough or whatever enough to be allowed to take up the space. Yeah, you're black enough, you're allowed. But we all have a way of sabotaging our creative process and telling ourselves we're not allowed until we actually run the gauntlet of self-hatred and get out there and decide to be gleeful.
Because I mean, this is yeah, and this is what I do whenever I do calligraphy. Immediately the self-hatred starts, but and it's harder at the beginning than towards the end. Although if I don't hit a certain threshold of performance during my session, it becomes merciless, because it's worse in the sense, I think I've been here for 45 minutes and I've achieved nothing. Now, I'm firmly of the belief that you can, in any one sitting, whether it's writing poetry or do any sort of art, you can actually be developing the muscles of skill and competence, but they're not necessarily present to you in that moment, but they're lying latent within you. And therefore, the next time you sit down, they may be that the potential that you've laid the groundwork for may be realized in that next potential. And this is where
I love that idea.
Spirituality and godliness comes in, that I think we can both agree on, is that it isn't in our time. This is where the mystery comes. It's about faith and about trust.
And about the discipline of turning up, the discipline of turning up you've just mentioned. Though I get a bit anxious about trying to be over disciplined, but what you've just said there is quite a good argument for turning up, isn't it? Even if nothing's happening.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Wow. Yeah.
Are you going to put that on the screen for us now, Chris? I'm just looking at the time because I know we love to chat on. Now you had to go at 11:30 and it's 11:29. So is your next appointment set in stone, or can we do a couple more poems, or should we just do them another day? What you choose?
I think we might need to leave them. Well, I'm literally just trying to push back my appointment slightly. So
you are
if we do, I'll put this poem up and we can talk about this poem and then end if that's all right.
Yeah,
I think we'll have to leave the next 2 for another time.
Lovely.
Okay, I'm just going to send this email.
I really hope that those who've stayed with us to the end here will feel encouraged to sit and write or create or do calligraphy or whatever, and to see it as a spiritual practice, an encounter with themselves. Because so many people say, I can't write, I'm not creative. And I think that just means they've not been encouraged in the right way to spend some time with themselves as a way in, as a way to know their own mystery and the mystery of others.
No,
The
absolutely.
mystery
And I
of the
think
world.
that is really important. So I've said that I'll be calling in 10 minutes. We've got 10 minutes, and let me share my screen with this poem so we can see it. Slightly less tiny font than the last one.
Do you know this bit, you'll redeclare your allegiance to determination? I've just been reading the other day a wonderful poem by Milosz. I might post it in the description, about declare your allegiance to desire.
Yeah.
Do you know that poem of Milosz about the beauty of reason? And he talks
No,
about,
I don't. No.
Well, this is something we have to talk about, because especially as Buddhism and Christianity have such very different, seemingly different relationships to desire.
Yeah.
And declaring one's allegiance to desire is the first thing I thought it was going to say when I saw allegiance to and it says determination.
Yeah,
But,
I mean, I think this determination, of course, is really crucial, and but it's funny that some of these poems have actually come through. I mean, this poem came pretty effortlessly, so in a way, it's a bit almost disingenuous of me to be saying, to telling other people to redeclare your allegiance to determination, because this poem didn't come through determination. Having said that, very much like I was saying with calligraphy, I think my general diligence in constantly honouring the ideas that surge up within my innermost being, I think creates the conditions by which, work that I'm proud of, work that I'm happy to share will come forth. So
and
I
that
don't
is
feel
a determination, isn't it?
It is. I don't think there's a I don't think for any given piece of work, determination needs to be the immediate prelude or leveraging in impulse to bringing that forth. I sometimes feel, as I'm sure you agree, some of the best work often comes apparently effortlessly.
Yes.
But the word is apparently.
Spontaneous touch.
The word is apparently, because I believe that the propitious conditions need to be created through hard work and through running the gauntlet of self-hate, essentially, and self-sabotage and all these other things we've discussed.
One of the things that springs to mind is a medieval storytelling garden. And you know how I love the beauties of the medieval world. And they would build walled storytelling gardens, and there would be fragrant herbs and flowers. And so, to build an enclosure, to build a garden within which people can then share their stories and songs is a beautiful thing. And I think it's a good metaphor for that, because you have to create the conditions within which something organic can grow. And I think what's happened in the world,
absolutely, that's a very good
return
metaphor.
to our beginning of thinking about ideology and so forth, is that if you take away the gardens of ideas and appropriate laws and so forth, what happens is that you just don't have the environments within which freedom can take place. Anarchy is really not necessarily a groundwork for mutual sharing, but of course sometimes things erupt. But anyway, let's look back at your poem. So push through those vilifications of your art that ring out whenever you are being most true. Loved this, because I think when we are being most true, that's when the strongholds arise. We knock against the strongholds. But you were talking about the asuras, weren't you, in the Buddhist tradition? And in the Christian tradition, there are the strongholds, which are ideas which are set up, puffed up in pride against the knowledge of God. And so
sure,
it's a bit like an ideology, isn't it? And so
absolutely,
when you're being most true, you're going to be knocking against the strongholds, because they don't want people to be people. They don't want joy and gleeful beatitudes that, push through those strains of self-sabotage against resistance and the ballast of your past. Yeah, wonderful. Echoing the contempt of those voices, a desperate resistance whose cries you barely hear when it's in your slipstream. Now, does that mean, I took that to mean that when you're in flow, you don't hear those
well, absolutely. And also
anti-cries, and that's really good.
Because resistance is ultimately petty. Resistance is ultimately petty and jealous, and it's a sort of mean-spirited. I like to think of resistance as sort of slightly mean-spirited, albeit universal and equally affecting us all like gravity, but nevertheless mean-spirited and sort of a bit sort of petulant. So I like to think of me sort of, or us sort of, easing into fifth gear and entirely accelerating past the sort of slightly futile machinations of resistance.
Fantastic.
And the idea of this resistance sort of, you know, making these sort of cries of indignation that how dare you sort of over go
put your
past
foot down,
my ability to destroy you and your entire creative endeavor.
Lovely.
So yeah, in the purgatory of self-doubt, the limbos of prevarication, as you know, I like to use Christian imagery in my poetry. Well, that's obviously, it's not exclusively, it's, you know, it's obviously it's a kind of, it's become, these have become metaphors that have become figures of speech and idioms, not obviously the purgatory of self-doubt, but, you know, the use of purgatory as a metaphor. But nevertheless, I feel it gives it a certain reverential quality, because I believe that, you know, prevarication is a state which stops us getting us to where we need to get to. And the magmas of unworthiness, I think it's this sense of, for me, it's most palpable when, as I say, I've been toiling at the paper with my brush and ink doing calligraphy, and I look down at what I've produced and I just feel this sense of shame and sense of dissatisfaction with myself and disappointment in myself, really. But again,
and yet you keep going and you push through, and then you reclaim those fondnesses that you feared would never be part of your legacy. And that's what I love, because I think this kind of image of toughness, you know, the robotic arm and the kind of, or the ego's, self-declarations, actually separate us from our true legacy and our true conversations, and then we can fail to reach imagination's homecoming. I just think that's such a great phrase, Elysiums of gladness. You know, because joy and gladness can seem frivolous, but they are the opposite. They are the arrival point of the spiritual path. The joy of the Lord is my strength.
Well, and there's maybe a transmutation that happens in the last stanza, in the sense that I'm not sure that the subject that I'm talking about in the last stanza is entirely human. It's sort of sentient being, a creative being, because, you know, it sort of frolics. It is our spirit, it is our creative spirit that frolics in the beatitudes of a life where God kisses every moment. And yes, I think imagination's homecoming, really. I mean, because imagination is in a way, there is no home for imagination. Imagination roves, it's a nomad. But I love this idea, precisely because of that, I love this idea that imagination could have a homecoming, and this could be a sort of Elysium.
Well, you know what's so fascinating is that I've just been reading an essay and watching a film about Tom Bombadil. Now, I know you've read a book on the Inklings, but I don't know, you haven't read The Lord of the Rings yet. Have you seen the films, Chris?
I haven't, no.
Well, there's a character in there that you won't see, because Peter Jackson missed out Tom Bombadil. And Tom Bombadil is a fascinating, frolicsome character who, probably closer than anyone in the whole book, this is what my friend Dan has been telling me about, who was in the first podcast, is like the Holy Spirit. He has this immense gladness and freedom, and he's always off through the woods singing, and he's the only person who is completely unaffected by the ring of power, which is the desire to have control over other people. So if they gave the ring to Tom Bombadil, he wouldn't want to keep the ring of power, but he would just forget all about it, because it's of no interest to him to dominate or control other people.
That's amazing.
And what I love about the end of your poem is you have captured this sense of God's freedom. And God invites us into freedom. And that's the path we have to push through to accept our freedom, which for some reason we resist.
Indeed.
So what a path we've got to.
Freedom is a great word to end.
Yeah, I believe it was sort of the end of Braveheart as well. But anyway.
Yes. Freedom.
Chris, thank you so much for spending time and extra time.
Been a pleasure, Sarah. And yeah, I mean, so much talent there, and not just on my side. There is so much talent. There is so much talent. You've got talent to burn, and I just feel like, yeah, both of us need to go and do our thing, and if we can support each other
and create
then...
that space for other people to do theirs. And I think that's the joy of art. It generates. It comes from the word. You know, what did you talk about? Fertilities, something fertilities, artless fertilities. There we go.
Artless fertilities.
So let's bless the listeners with their own artless fertilities, and look forward to what comes back. Thank you, Chris.
It's been a pleasure.
Appointment.
I do, but it's been wonderful. Hello, listeners. Goodbye, listeners and viewers. I hope you've enjoyed, and thanks very much for having me on this podcast, Sarah. It's always a pleasure, and you're a great talent and a generous-hearted individual. So I wish you all the best.
Thank you, love. God bless.
God bless.
See you soon.
Bye.